by thanking both Günther Teubner and Anna Beckers for inviting us to this terrific conference in such a beautiful setting and with such impeccable organization. Well, let me begin by thanking both Günther Teubner and Anna Beckers for inviting us to this terrific conference in such a beautiful setting and with such impeccable organization. So thanks very much. My name is Hans Linder and I'll be chairing this first session. The title of the session is Beyond Nation-State Constitutions, the Move to the Societal and to the Transnational. I think it's fair to say that the move, academic move that has led to this conference began at least as far back as Günther's essay on global Bukovina more than 20 years ago, in which he argued very forcefully and powerfully and compellingly, I think, for the need to move on beyond the paradigm of state law and international law and thinking through contemporary developments. Laws such as lex mercatoria, internet law, just to name a couple of examples, could no longer be understood in their legal character on the basis of the concept of law that had been developed under the aegis of state law. Importantly, I think that Günther was right in claiming that it would be a big mistake to view these forms of legal developments as a form of underdeveloped law, such that they would become full-fledged elements of law to the extent that they began to appear in the form of state law. Examples of why it would not be adequate to view them as forms of state law would include the fact that they were, in many cases, the product of private self-regulation. Furthermore, that you could no longer capture their sense in terms of the boundedness of state law. And I think also, and thirdly and importantly, that they simply no longer can be understood in terms of the kinds of political settlements which are proper to state law. I think that the latest work that Günther has been doing on constitutionalism and state constitutionalism is an effort to work out these first ideas in terms of their implications for constitutionalism. And the claim being, I think, that to speak of societal constitutionalism is not to speak a form of underdeveloped political constitutionalism, but precisely the need to generalize and re-specify the notion of constitutionalism which has held in state and political constitutionalism. The format of the session will be the following. I will ask the two speakers, who I will just briefly present now, to present their papers during some 25 minutes. And then we'll have a chance for questions and answers, and I'll take questions one by one and give the speakers a chance to respond. I would ask those of you who want to ask questions to be very concise, and I would request the speakers to be concise as well. That gives us a chance to have a whole array of questions. Let me briefly present the two speakers. Chris Thornhill is Professor of European Political Thought at Glasgow. Before joining Glasgow, he's been at Sussex and at King's in London. His most recent research is in statehood, constitutionalism and constitutionalization, the social and legal preconditions of political legitimacy. And he has a recent monograph on these issues entitled A Sociology of Constitutions. Emilios Christodoulidis is also at Glasgow. He's professor of legal theory. Before joining Glasgow, he taught at Edinburgh. Emilios' research interests are in constitutional theory, democratic theory, critical legal theory, and transitional justice. His dissertation has received 2 prizes. It's an excellent dissertation, and he's the editor of the Edinburgh-Glasgow Law Society series and editor of 2 journals as well. So without further ado, I would ask Chris to please take the floor.
Thank you very much. If you just put it somewhere, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organisers of the conference. It's a great delight and privilege to be here. I'm not entirely accustomed to such grandeur, I must say. So I'm rather nervous standing here, but nervously delighted. So I'm going to start the ball rolling today with a paper on the transnational dimension of contemporary constitutionalism, perhaps raising certain questions about the extent to which the transnational dimension of contemporary constitutionalism is irreducibly societal. And I'd like to make a specific argument about the ongoing political content of transnational constitutionalism, hoping at least to provide a certain degree of provocative impetus for debate. It's become clear in the last decade or so, it's become visible that very distinctive patterns of constitutionalism and legal norm formation are developing, assuming effective constitutional status across national territorial boundaries. This has been analysed from a number of different standpoints, ranging from kind of post-Kantian enthusiasm for what might appear to be an emergent global legal order, to literature denying the presence of anything except jurisdictional pluralism in the legal apparatus of modern society. It ranges from literature fraught with anxiety about the loss of sovereign jurisdiction to literature that identifies the homology of power and geographical terrain as hopeless now at war. Now, I can't really reconstruct all the lines of debate about this in this context, but what unifies these very diverse lines, these very diverse bodies of literature, is the sense that the constitutional form of contemporary society reflects the demise of the classical principles of constitutionalism. Clear normative hierarchy, strict allocation of powers in the state, fixed public control of a societal domain, the loss of monopolistic, although normatively curtailed, authority of one body of public institutions for the production of laws in a given territory. Above all, running across these different lines of analysis is the view, perhaps the intuition, sometimes somewhat unspoken, that constituent power as a determinant of modern constitutionalism, often seen as the defining concept of modern constitutionalism, has been eroded. Indeed, it's widely argued, I think this might be seen as a point of convergence in these different bodies of literature, that law can no longer be traced to a founding point of regress. Expressed differently, the origin of law is law itself. And law, even primary constitutional law, is derived from other laws, recursively, internalistically, typically from laws applied across an international arena through charters, conventions, and courts, and so on. Law, therefore, or all power, even the power to found new constitutions, is now legally pre-constituted. The classical argument about constituent power, I mean, we can trace this back to Sieyès in the French Revolution, but more recently, in the 20th century, in Carré de Malherbe and Carl Schmitt, the idea that a decision, a pre-legal decision, must authorise legal order is now, I think, redundant. Where is the decision? Who makes the decision? This is very closely connected to the rise, the increasing autonomy of rights in the international legal domain. Indeed, it appears to be the fate of contemporary constitutionalism that constituent and constitutive power become inseparable, and traditional checks on constituent power, particularly judicial actors applying norms derived from concepts of rights, become, as they're transplanted across different national settings, as it were mobile sources of already constituted constituent power. This is not made entirely explicit in much of the literature, but seems to be something like a residual point of convergence between the different lines of debate. The elision of constituent power and constituted power in the actions of transnational judicial bodies, and especially in the judicial application of rights reaching across national boundaries, characterises constitutionalism in the contemporary transnational setting in a number of different ways. It characterises constitutionalism at the level of national and international public law, but it also characterises the more informal constitutional order of society's distinct functional domains, that being the topic of the conference. Now, I'd like to run through, perhaps given that this is an introductory, the first paper in the session, I'd like to run through what seem to me to be salient examples of this phenomenon. But I'd then like to propose perhaps a distinct or alternative perspective through which we might analyse the displacement of constituent power and the rise of rights norms as sources of constituent power across national boundaries. Firstly, this phenomenon expresses itself in the relationship between rights and political sovereignty. We can see this at a national level. In most national settings, it's effectively unthinkable that constituent power can be exercised as an autonomous form of agency. Effectively, constituent power is pre-constituted by judicial norms derived from a transnational legal domain. And this results in the rise of, in particular, of constitutional courts, powerful judicial bodies exercising constitutional review or judicial review to constrain the power of national legislatures. So that courts, borrowing, or very often borrowing jurisprudence from a transnational legal corpus, strike down legislative decisions or pre-form, predefine the parameters within which legislative decisions can be made, often in fact predefining the very content of political constitutions. In this respect, we can see that courts often effectively interpret a framework of constitutional law ex nihilo. Courts create the basic framework of constitutional law such that constituent power, the decision on which political order may be seen to reside, diminishes or even disappears. So we can identify here this rising internalism or a rising autonomy of a transnational legal domain, leading to this diminution or displacement of constituent power. We can see this in the emergence of transnational polities very clearly, or transnational quasi-polities. We can take the European Union as a classical example of this, if we can indeed see this as quasi-polity, in which the European Court of Justice, in fact, originally designated itself as bound by the jurisprudence of rights, thereby authorising itself to override national norms and, in fact, effectively to pre-constitute constitutional norms in different national settings. In both examples, we can see how nationally and transnationally contemporary society has increasingly built its constitutional form around this illusion of constituent and constituted power, such that constituent power, which originally formed the authorising regress for political constitutions, is widely absorbed by norms referring to rights. Rights have made it possible for the political system to distill the basis of law's legitimacy internalistically within the law itself. The constitution of contemporary society in these respects produces and authorises itself illegally by a pre-constituted or endlessly auto-constituent power stored and reproduced in the form of rights. We can see this phenomenon also in the emergence of what we might call a spontaneous or self-referential transnational constitutional domain, in which rights act at varying societal levels in internally just generative fashion and give substance to a self-contained body of legal norms, exercising effective constitutional power across national borders. We can see this most obviously at the level of constitutional law or public legal organisation. Obviously most constitutions effectively admit the primacy of international presumptions in favour of rights over national decisions. But we can also see this at a less formal level of constitutional organisation, displayed in particular in the increasing coalescence between different judicial communities and the widespread transportation of legal rulings, norms and optimal procedures from case to case across national boundaries, so that the law or rights norms installed, conserved within the law, increasingly promote something like a judicial lingua franca to facilitate the translation of legal rulings from one jurisdiction to another. So we can see in these respects the emergence of what we might call a recursively founded transnational political constitution. We can also see, in parallel to this, the emergence of a transnational sub-political constitution, again associated with and identifiable in a series of somewhat distinct phenomena. First, we can see this in the proliferation of private rights, singular private rights in most national societies, stimulating a rise in private litigation, assuming in itself quasi-constitutional implications. However, we can see other sub-political processes of constitutional formation. We can see this spontaneous constitutionalisation induced by the fact that the transnational political arena is increasingly populated by persons and organisations, NGOs, private governance bodies and so on, which utilise reference to rights to assume a position in the margins of government, or even effectively to make the law. In these respects, in each of these dimensions, effective constitutional norms underpinning acts of law are produced without reference to sources of agency outside the law. They're authenticated in highly autonomous, contingent and deeply hybridised fashion. Above all, what characterises this emergent constitutionality is the recursivity of law. The net result of these tendencies, therefore, is that we can identify a condition of what I would call multi-normative constitutionalism in contemporary transnational society. Now, the content and substance of this concept has been exposed to debate, not lastly by Walsh Berman, who I think is here, whose work I would like to flag up as extremely important in this analysis. What seems to me to be somewhat overlooked in this process, however, is the fact that rights, norms, international norms or transnational norms in respect of rights, are usually seen as in some way limiting or constraining the plurality of contemporary constitutionalism. But in actual fact, rights can equally be seen as drivers, as principles or institutions giving impetus to the increasing pluralisation of transnational law. This occurs through the overlayering of national and transnational legal sources, but it also occurs through the overlayering of private and public legal sources. Examples of this have, of course, been provided by Gunther Teubner. Above all, we can say, I have to condense a lot of material here, the ability of different layers of the emerging transnational governance apparatus to obtain support and effectively vindicate rights norms or expectations in respect of rights provides a structure and orientation for global governance regimes in its totality. The rights increasingly form an underlying internalised reference for a highly disparate set of constitutional forms, each of which solidifies normative constructs in pluralistic and politically uncentered fashion. Now, cutting to the chase, or cutting to the heart of my argument, I'd like to suggest that under contemporary constitutional conditions, rights have emerged as a political code. Or the distinction of rights, not rights, relevant to rights, not relevant to rights, becomes the central, internalistic and auto-constituent device by which a society distinguishes those exchanges requiring political regulation from those exchanges that do not. The rights code makes possible the creation of a relatively stable inclusionary structure for the construction of legal expectations, the transmission of political power, underscored by reasonably coherent distinctions between law and non-law, politics and non-politics, under conditions where this would otherwise be impossible. So the distinction between rights or relevant to rights, irrelevant to rights as a matrix for organising social exchanges has become central to the capacity of the contemporary global political system for transmitting and reproducing power, consolidating, generating political structures, often against the background of highly pluralistic and contingent environments. Indeed, rights, we might say, increasingly act ex nihilo as the founding auto-constituent principle, enabling the preservation of certain political structures, or indeed of politicality per se, within the conditions of an otherwise deeply acentric global society. It's often argued, indeed, again, this would form a point of convergence within the different lines of literature. It's often argued that the auto-constituent character, the self-referentiality or the internalism of the emergent constitutional system is characterized or appears as forming a deep caesura, deep break with the principles of classical constitutionalism, as I mentioned at the beginning. Indeed, this is implicit in the very fact that we've seen a migration of constituent force from the concept of constituent power to the concept of rights. I would describe this as perhaps the defining principle of contemporary constitutionalism. That constituent power has been absorbed by rights, and now rights form the basic political code for the reproduction of political structures, the ongoing recursive transmission of political power. I'd like to suggest, however, that this reading of the relationship between contemporary constitutionalism and classical constitutionalism in some respects rests on what I would describe as a rather simplified, or perhaps even excessively literalistic, understanding of classical constitutions. I'd like very briefly to outline a possible construction of classical constitutions which will allow us to understand ways in which the various pluralistic forms of contemporary constitutionalism have actually evolved from a store of concepts, a store of functional mechanisms which existed in the semantics of classical constitutionalism. First, I would say, although classical constitutions authorise themselves through reference to constituent power, claiming as the foundation of political legitimacy that constituent power was external to the political system, and that constituent power marked the exercise of pre-legal agency. In fact, this was never the case. This is actually clearly illustrated in the earliest doctrines of constituent power. The concept of constituent power was always a paradox. It was always a semantic form which enabled the political system to authorise itself through external reference, whilst in fact internalising the grounds for its self-authorisation. The concept of constituent power was an essential paradox, enabling the formation of a political system able to restrict the factual external presence of the people in government. This means classical constitutions claim to derive legitimacy from a source standing outside legal institutions, but were in fact simply use this as a paradox. Similarly, we can also identify that constituent power in the first instance, in its first conception, was integrally bound up with the concept of rights. Indeed, the power to exercise constituent power, the very notion of agency bound up with the concept of constituent power, was the power to exercise rights. I think this is clear in all the revolutionary settings of early modernity, particularly in late early modernity in France and the USA, in which the exercise of constituent power was already pre-constituted within an overarching normative constitution. 5 minutes, okay, thanks. To this degree, therefore, it seems that if classical constitutionalism is subject to a functionalist reconstruction, many aspects of the diagnosis that we've experienced an epochal change from classical constitutionalism to contemporary constitutionalism reflect a somewhat literalistic analysis of contemporary constitutions, of classical constitutions rather, taking the vocabulary of classical constitutionalism too literally at its word. Now, of course, we can see certain deviations between classical constitutionalism and contemporary constitutionalism, but the continuities are also very profound if we expose classical constitutions to a functionalist analysis, which attempts to, as it were, discern, disclose the functional meaning behind the literal meaning of the founding concepts of constitutionalism. In sum, we can suggest that the progressive formation of a transnational constitutional order, both at the level of public law and at the level of private interaction, private legal interaction, which is shaped by the rising autonomy of rights and the pluralistic internalisation of rights norms within political processes, in many ways re-articulates the sociological functions that always inhered in the design of constitutional democracy. Of course, these principles have now been severed from stable centres of political order and political organisation. But this dynamic, this trajectory, moving from the political to the sub-political sphere, was in many ways always implied, or at least provided for, within the conceptual apparatus of classical constitutions. To conclude, if a historical functionalist approach to constitutional rule is utilised, constitutional democracy in its classical sense might be observed not in the first instance as a volitional construction in which collective forms of extra-legal agency are channeled into the political system, but rather as a form of abstracted inclusion for the political and the legal system of modern society. Indeed, classical constitutions specifically enabled legal and political institutions to integrate the social exchanges of members of highly differentiated or increasingly differentiated societies in even, positive and reproducible fashion, to render societies subject to uniform, internally stabilised and extensible normative expectations, to establish the basic building blocks for the use of political power as an abstract, flexible and positively circulated resource. Now, if this functional approach to classical constitutions is accepted, the new models of constitutionalism that we can identify today, implied both in judicialised concepts of democracy at the national level, in the emergence of transnational polities, but also in the more private, informally constitutionalised governance regimes, these can be seen to cement not a negation, but in fact a continuous functional extension of the original normative form of constitutional democracy. Above all, to make a final point, if we accept the hypothesis that I proposed earlier, that contemporary constitutionalism has converged around the rights code as an internalistic reference for the ongoing reproduction of political power, consolidation of political structures, for the relatively even inclusion of social exchanges, this code was in fact always written into the political system from the moment in which constitutionalism became a very dominant rhetoric or a very dominant semantic in modern society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll open the discussion now. It's obvious that when I refer to audience, I don't only refer to the participants or the invited speakers, but also to the general audience who is free to present questions. You might want to actually stay here, or you have to respond to that. Sure. Does anyone want to pose the first question? Please.
Just to get things rolling.
Sure.
You talk about convergence.
Sorry, there's a mic.
Okay. You talk about convergence and rights as drivers of a broader constitutional order. And I was just wondering about the relationship that you see between rights on the one hand and all of the plural normative order stuff that you refer to at the beginning part. So, in other words, is your thesis that growing ideas of rights and what you call sort of the new model of constitutionalism, is that across normative systems? In other words, is that a new universal, or is it something that somehow interacts with the pluralism that you referred to at the beginning?
Thanks very much for the question. I'm sorry if this didn't come out very clearly. Obviously, there is a kind of global constitutionalist argument which would say that we possess a set of international rights norms, and different actors, both state actors and more informally organised actors, are simply constituted subjects within this order. Now, I don't want to make this argument. I'd like strongly to argue against this position, although I would like to say that the increasing primacy of rights norms is in fact within itself a source of pluralism.
That's what I thought you wanted to say, but then I don't understand all the convergence language.
Well, the rights become increasingly a general reference to which different institutions are prepared to lay claim. Not only different institutions, but private actors are prepared to lay claim as it were, kind of mobile sources of authorization for their political position, for their particular action. So it becomes something like a transferable framework in which different actors are able to position themselves in relation to existing political structures. So I would actually see this as a driver for pluralism as opposed to a driver for uniformity. I guess there remains a residual convergence in the fact that this vocabulary has made itself so readily available. But the actual utility that is drawn from this vocabulary is very different from setting to setting, would be the thesis that I'd like to suggest.
Any further questions? Please.
I think I very much understand, thank you, your point about rights having this function of defining what can or cannot be regulated. So my question is, how do we recognize where a right claim exists? Or how do courts recognize where right claims exist? But U.S. Constitution that I'm a little bit familiar with is the problem of state action.
Yeah.
To what extent the state is responsible for inequalities or exclusions. Or I guess you talk about the vertical and horizontal effect of constitutional rights. So I was wondering, in terms of functional differentiation, how can we recognize where a right claim exists?
How can we recognise, within what setting? I mean, in many cases, the rights norms are simply written through processes of standard setting or through international conventions. But you mean actually within a court setting?
Yes, because we are seeing many new rights actually being recognized, let's say, that were not there 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Like privacy rights.
Sure.
Or right to same-sex marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Under what condition can individuals lay claim to a right that is not necessarily guaranteed or specified rights that are more general or used to be general? To say, okay, this is one example of extending that where you can actually bring in the transnational aspect.
Well, through a multiplicity, I mean, I'm sorry if this is an exit strategy answer. I mean, through a multiplicity of processes, I would say partly through courts borrowing rulings through a kind of emergent through the emergence of transjudicial norms, through which courts borrow download jurisdiction from higher conventions, partly also through the proliferation and expansion of rights expectations that are built into already sedimented rights norms. So that one rights norm generates other rights norms.
I have a hunch. Maybe I can say then you tell me what's your take on that.
Yeah, far away.
I was wondering if the way we think of rights in terms of the Lumanian terms of a safeguard against the differentiation. So can we say if a system has a functionally differentiated scope, a societal scope, and if that function is differentiated from politics, people can lay claim to equal access? Let's say if marriage is not a matter of religion, is a right to have certain...
Sure. I mean, that would be very close to my view of the actual the substance or functional content of rights, in terms of what rights do and how they operate, what the specific functions are within the context of differentiated society. How they're actually accessed would seem to me to raise, it raises a set of different jurisdictional questions. It's very different from national setting to national setting. So you have to look at the jurisprudence of individual courts to say exactly how this works, and how this works in Britain is going to be very different from how this works in the USA. But in terms of your analysis of the functional content of rights, that's very close to the account of rights I want to propose. But this seems two separate questions, but I have to just discuss this more informally, because I think you have to give a whole series of different examples to say actually how rights at a transnational level are accessed, because the national jurisdictions still impact very greatly on these different processes. But there is a uniform tendency towards this.
Gudrun and Florian Brödel have both signaled that they'd like to ask questions, so the first, please, to
Chris, I think what you are doing is to develop a very powerful theory of power as the basis of constitutionalism. And you manage to go beyond the state constitutions by extending the analysis of the power phenomenon beyond the state. So you look at social power and you look how state power works within society. But I have the feeling that there is a power in your theory, an energy, which is so strong that it reaches beyond the limits of your theory. And my argument would go as follows. My question would be as follows. I mean, if you say, and I think that's what you say, that constitutions traditionally formalize the communicative medium of power in the nation state, then the question needs to be answered, don't we also observe the formalization of other communicative media as well? So, for example, money, highly formalized today, and with the assistance of legal fundamental rules, quasi-constitutional. The same to truth, the self-constitutionalization of science and epistemology and theories and all that, with the help of certain and so on. So it's the same to news media. So there are other communicative media that have the similar process as you described. What about them? If, secondly, the limitative role of constitution comes in, and you argue that constitutions usually limit the power of the state, then wouldn't we have to ask the same question again for the other media? Where are the limitations of the economy? Where are the limitations of knowledge and so on? That they don't reach into different spheres. So your answer would be, of course, rights. And then you make the connection to law and politics. But is it not true that rights are not only adapted to politics, but also they are adapted to other social systems, and they change their character, they change their form when we speak about rights in the economy or in culture. So here would be the question, can we expect your next book to generalize the theory beyond the limits of power?
Thank you very much. Now, the second question is more open terrain, so I probably will only be able to give a rather fragmented response to this. First question, the analytical diagnosis is entirely correct, and I'd like to explain constitutions as patterns of, let's say, reflecting a process of recursive self-organisation within the medium of political power. Now, the argument that I would set out in response to the first question, albeit tentative, I would not wish to present this as a conclusively evolved hypothesis. But in reference to other communicative media, not specifically identifiable as political, well, where is the dimension in their organisation, either national or transnational, which does not presuppose political power? where is that dimension? Let's say the organisation of the economy. Well, of course, there are economic interactions which are not in any very express level political. But any process of transformation or any process of transition, or as it were, rerouting, redirection of economic communications, similarly also scientific communications or aesthetic communications, will of necessity presuppose what I would call a structure building, will of necessity avail itself of a structure building dynamic originating within a political system, or in which power is a not negligible source of structure. I cannot find an element in these communicative media which I can find elements in other communicative media which are not expressly bound up with any political intervention. But there are exceptional moments where the structural organisation of other communicative media will avail itself of power. And to this degree, it would seem that we are looking at something like a functional extension of classical forms of constitutionalisation. This would be my immediate response. Rights as adapted to other social systems. Now, I'd like to say that the underlying theory that I would wish to propose about rights is that rights can be seen as institutes that drive something like a socially calibrated transmission of political power. That they organise a political system around a balanced dynamic of inclusion and exclusion. Now, this would seem to me to apply also to the status of rights within other social systems. That we can understand rights in other social systems in analogy to this concept. I don't want to say that all rights are exclusively political, or that rights have an exclusive status to the political system. They do play a particularly prominent role in the formation of political systems, and they also play a formative role in the process, in the extension of political systems from the national to the transnational arena. Indeed, again, this is obviously just a response to a question that may subsequently require revision, but the use of rights or the implementation of rights in, say, for example, rights of free expression or in the arts or rights of exchange in the economy also make possible constructive, or what I would call structure building, convergence between the political system and these other spheres of social exchange. So rights enable couplings between the political system and other spheres of society. They make possible, as it were, structure building intervention of the political system within other areas.
Do you have follow-up questions?
Sure.
Have you finished answering, or you need to interrupt?
I finished temporarily. If a hypothesis articulated at such a rudimentary level could be considered finished, but certainly for the purposes of this discourse.
Well, I'm very intrigued by how you bring in the question of rights. Itself is somewhat ambiguous category, certainly, sure. As a kind of a mechanism that permits a social calibration of the constitutionalizing, right?
At one level. At one level, sure.
At one level, right. And so I'm just, since you have been doing all of this extensive research and picking up on our conversation yesterday also in Latin America, these new constitutions, I mean, though that is a lot of rights there, are you detecting other categories that allow for a socially calibrated constitutionalizing besides rights? Do you see anything in there in all your research? It's a little follow-up.
Yeah, could you, when you say other forms of agency, could you just specify exactly, so I know what kind of ballpark we're talking about?
I did not say agency, because I find agency. I accept your definition as you put it out there, so I'm not contesting that. But you yourself said when some question came up, I think Günther's question, or your answer to it, you know, how do you get to that establishing? And you say that the limits, you were talking about limitations, and how that indicates the possibility of a constitutionalizing. And so then rights becomes the actor, the critical actor. And my question is whether in all your research, it's a little empirical question, are you detecting?
Sure, it's an extremely interesting question. Thank you very much. Obviously, I can only, once again, sketch out a slightly improvised response to this. It's a question that I've posed to myself quite extensively about pressures or forces that tie together an increasing transnational, international presumption in favour of rights and the application of rights at a more societal, national societal level. What actually drives this? Of course, the big argument out there is that this is driven by international economic elites, and that somehow this is the international rights jurisprudence is imposed externally upon different societal actors or different national actors in order to stabilise the position of economic hegemons. And this seems to me, obviously, it's difficult to deny the validity of this argument wholesale. I would not wish to do this, but I think there is more at play. I think there is substantially more at play. And if we can identify a number of societies across the globe, from China, I know we have a China expert here, so I have to be a bit careful what I say. And he's probably a Latin America expert as well, so I have to be doubly careful. But we can identify a number of societies. The same applies in North Africa as well, where the impetus towards the intersection between national jurisprudence, national jurisdiction, transnational jurisprudence, transnational jurisdiction has undergone a process of what you might call incubated acceleration. Now, I would suggest that this is partly driven by institutional weaknesses within these states themselves. It's driven partly by the survival of quasi-patrimonial forms of authority, which prove extremely inflexible, provide very restricted bases for legislation within national societies. Indeed, in Weberian terms, one could almost say this brings with it an accelerated transition from patrimonial to rational legal modes of political organisation. So I would say, as a very broad macro-sociological perspective on this, I'd like to put that in some way out there as a response to the kind of triumph of global capitalism argument, which seems to me to not tell only some of the truth. Is that a satisfactory response to it?
Well, I don't want to be okay. So far satisfactory.
Okay. Thank you.
So far, well, that's good.
I suppose my comment will sound familiar to you, however, I think it should have a room also in this conference. I mean, when you tell us about the essentials about classical constitutionalism, for me something very important is missing in there, and which is the point which allows you, and to omit the point allows you to draw your functional analysis for modern constitutionalism. This is that you say, well, in each form of classical constitutionalism, rights play a pivotal role to restrict state power. Well, let's say Frankfurt reading of classical constitutionalism is different.
Which Frankfurt? 1950s, 1980s?
Until today. Until today. It says that, well, there's one very important distinction between the American version and the French version, because for the French version, it is the most important point is to not the rights talk as a restriction, but to claim supremacy of democratic legislation over rights. So the rights talk doesn't play a restrictive role at all, though it seems to me that this is how you're presenting it nevertheless. So it was never the idea for the French model that rights could restrict the constituted power, but it was a kind of rhetoric that this is what democracy is about. It's about constituting rights, but not as a restriction of the democratic process. So this is a Frankfurt argument, as you will know. I would like to receive your comment, because this is so important, because it is not so easy to find or to reconstruct this function of classical constitutionalism in modern constitutionalism.
Yeah. But I would have, I'd like to make again, it's an extremely complicated question to which I can't really satisfactorily do justice in this context. Now, the question of rights in the French Revolution is not as cut and dry as it's habitually well, it's quite clear the theory of constituent power set out by Sieyès articulates constituent power, explains constituent power as part of a claim to rights, not only not a claim to substantive rights, but as a claim to equality of the rights, so legal uniformity. Also, under the French constitutions, I mean, it's clear that there wasn't a Supreme Court, so the question of the justiciability of rights is very prominent. But it would be very difficult, I think, to argue, except for the Jacobin interview, that rights had a negligible normative status. I think rights clearly acted as political constraining devices. After the exercise of constituent power, the exercise of constituent power is obviously has more prominence in France than in the USA, the theory of constituent power. But the point I was making is somewhat different, which is that constituent power in its most classical conception, Sieyès, it's quite clear that constituent power is an exclusionary power. Now, I'd just like to be, that's the argument I was attempting to draw out. Now, so I would suggest that this distinction between the two constitutional revolutionary traditions, in this respect as in others, is often overblown. I think the suggestion that there was no concept of constituent power, or the concept of constituent power in the USA was weak, is not accurate. The argument that rights did not act as powerful constraining institutes in the political process, or in France, is also not accurate.
What role to play for democratic legislation, even if it is restricted by rights? I mean, that doesn't play a role.
Sorry.
But what role to play for
in what context? In France?
In general, in classical constitutionalism.
Well,
if you just pick out the rights dimension, what role for democracy to play?
In classical constitutionalism, well, the democratic substance of classical constitutionalism was ultimately very restricted. Ultimately. And I would suggest that in both models of classical constitutionalism, France and the USA, after the original outburst of democratic or republican fervour, rights became quite clearly the dominant elements of constitutional organisation, either through two different models, through the transfer of political power from legislatures to courts in the USA, or through the use of rights to create a semi-detached executive structure in France. Cynically, but historically, in a fashion that is not historically inaccurate, I would suggest that rights immediately became the dominant principles within constitutionalism, and this of necessity led to a diminution of the democratic dimension. So the simultaneity or the co-originality of rights and democracy, I feel Frankfurter Luft, you know, the co-originality of democracy and rights, it would seem to me, is it rests upon a series of rather literalistic assumptions to which I previously alluded. And I'm more interested in something like a kind of functional archaeology of constitutions, trying to map out how this actually worked in society. But I'm very sorry, rights typically act as institutions which restrict the democratic authority of political systems. That's quite specifically what they do. It doesn't mean that they obviate democracy, but they restrict democracy.
Okay, thanks very much. We have two further questions. The gentleman over there, and then Paul Pierre.
I'm Ugo Mattei. I have two questions, or two brief comments. I have a problem that is pretty deep in the use of the language of rights outside of specification of the distinction between property rights and other kinds of rights. Because it seems to me that in using the idea of rights in such a broad way as you're doing, as a basic constitutional source, a very basic constituent source, you basically cover up the fundamental dimension of the way in which capital works. And keeping, things like same-sex marriage together with corporate possibility of being defended for takings. Seems to me that is like using the Rechtsgeschaft argument in the early legal theories in the 19th century to talk together about, creating a corporation or entering into a marriage. It's such an abstraction that ends up being suspect per se. So that's the point that I have, and I'd like you to comment a little bit between whether the distinction between property rights and other kinds of rights shouldn't be present at this level of analysis. And the second question is that if you're interested in an archaeology of rights, as you claim, maybe you should be interested in the most recent layer too. Because it seems to me that if there is one thing that is happening in these last 5 or 6 years, is that rights don't matter in constitution making. The strategy of using rights used to be behind, structural adjustment, for example, in Latin America or in Africa, until the 90s, and because there was still some need of justification in legal terms of the exercise of power. Whereas today, in situations like Greece, for example, just to stay very close to home here, but even in the Italian constitutional experience of these days, if there is one thing that doesn't matter, are rights. Actually, all the constituent process is carried on in order to take away rights that have been able to reach some kind of constitutional status in the last 20 years or so that the economic emergency, or the rhetoric of whatever, the need not to end up like Greece or whatever, has completely taken over even the grammar rights. So I was wondering whether you can see this as a sort of final layer of constitutional evolution in the moment in which we look for constitutionalism outside of effective public sovereignty.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Two entirely different questions. I mean, it seems to me a slightly circular set of questions. And on one level you want to say, well, dominant rights are private rights. So explain the relationship between private rights and more substantial political rights. And then you want to say, but rights as constructed in the second category don't matter. They're really vital. Both questions are very important. Sorry, can I keep my answer short? Can you keep the questions easy? The rights don't matter is, well, I would dispute this. In fact, I would say, measured against previous periods of, without wishing to present myself in any way as an apologist, just at a level as far as possible of diagnostic analysis, it would seem that the constraining force of constitutional presumptions remains strong, particularly if measured against other periods of economic emergency. I don't really like the category of economic emergency, but if we wish to apply that, then it seems to me that the discourse of rights has not been entirely has not become entirely secondary, although, of course, its status has been diminished. But we have to measure this against previous conditions of emergency in which the presumption in favour of rights was simply annihilated. So constitutional presumptions, it seems to me, remain potent and pervasive, although necessarily assume somewhat modified status. We can have lengthy polemics about this, but I've been told to keep my answer short.
I'll take one last question, and that was Paul Kerr.
I'll be brief, I hope so at least, and simple and easy. And what is, basically the question is, what is the status of semantics? And it falls a bit up on what Wordle was, the theme that you were dealing with Wordle, in the sense that you say, okay, there is in classical constitutionalism, there was a need for some kind of internal semantic construction of an external reference point, a nation, a democratic community, a polity, whatever it would be. And then you say that was not the defining or the most important dimension of constitutions, and I agree with that. But there still seemed to be some sort of structural, functional necessity of having that. There was no classical constitution without it. Yeah. So even though it might not have been the dominating element, it was there. And first of all, then comes the questions in that sense, because saying this is just semantics is then saying it in your positivist reading, because you are quasi-positivist in my reading of your books, but then it doesn't exist, or it doesn't have any independent, autonomous meaning. But semantics have an autonomous standing too. People jump out of the trenches and get blown up because of semantics. The world is moved. It has an autonomous impact on the world itself. And secondly, if you go to contemporary constitutions, is there not any kind of structural need for the similar kind of reference to some kind of internal semantic construction in order to have a constitution? It might not be a nation, but then something else. Can you have a constitution without this kind of reference to some kind of semantic construction? And you seem to say that you could actually have contemporary institutions which neither factually or semantically operate with such kinds of references. Would that be possible?
Very briefly, this was supposed to be an easy question. It didn't seem very easy. The question about semantics, I mean, I do make use of this concept, in that I would like to say that the defining notions or the authorizing notions that have inscribed themselves into bodies of constitutional law should not be taken literally, should not be seen as transparent to actually factually occurring processes. Now, it would seem to me that there is a homology between classical constitutionalism and contemporary constitutionalism. And the classical constitutionalism, quite clearly, the longer period of classical constitutionalism coincided with the emergence of geographically extensive and functionally differentiated societies. This would seem to be historically pretty clear. Marx would agree that we almost uniquely, in that this would seem to describe a process in which political power, legal organisation, legal structures were, as it were, disembedded from highly localised forms of authority and constructed across extensible national arenas. And the semantic forms of constitutionalism, they made this possible. In that they generated forms of uniform inclusion that could be extended across ever-widening and ever more differentiated social arenas, social surfaces. Now, the emergence of global constitutionalism or transnational constitutionalism in more recent social processes seems to be, in many respects, a socio-functional level to replicate this process. It's a second level of geographical extension. This is the semantic order that maps onto this that makes this possible. But the point that I'd like to make is that the semantic of contemporary constitutionalism, I mean, accepting high levels of variation in different conjunctions, is and is likely to remain in however attenuated form rights. In that is the reference. That is the semantic. Accepting, not wishing to appear as a kind of neo-reactionary positivist. I am a positivist, but I'm not a neo-reactionary. Not wishing to appear as a neo-reactionary positivist, I would say, of course, it would be absurdly counterfactual to say there are no variations in the the extent to which rights norms are embedded or applied, nonetheless the presumption in respect of rights, looking beyond Europe, remains extremely strong. I mean, in the global south, the situation that you're describing would seem in many respects inconceivable because the rights discourse has become so powerful. So the semantic will be right. But I would say there's a functional process behind this. I mean, I think from a systems theoretical perspective, the notion of semantic describes a form of correlation between inner systemic processes and wider patterns of social transformation. So is that okay? Yeah? Thank you very much.
Okay, well,